Welcome back, everybody. The Cold War Ends is the next video on the agenda. A few vocabulary words for the day: Iran-Contra Affair, Glasnost, and Perestroika. Read to understand and then continue on. So the Cold War has been in progress ever since the 1940s, latter half of the 1940s, and is continuing into the 1980s. At this point in time, Reagan truly believes that increasing in large increases in defense spending will help bankrupt the Soviet Union. So that is exactly what Reagan does. He does spend a lot of time building up um, the defense military of the United States. He has a military plan that gets dubbed Star Wars because of its futuristic um, idea of having lasers from land and lasers from space shooting down any missiles that were headed toward the United States. It never really materializes, but nevertheless, the idea and the money spent on defensive military and for the defense of the United States is high. At the same time, the Soviet Union does have issues. It has some economic problems along with some other things. And one of the things that comes about because of those problems are reforms, including glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost is a Russian term for new openness, and this is a policy that what it is about is a new openness of discussing national problems within the Soviet Union. Perestroika is more economically focused, also 1980s, and it's trying to restructure the economy of the Soviet Union because it has become stagnant. It had some problems like the United States in a way that they experienced in the 1970s and 1980s. Additionally, one of the things that occurred was Reagan and Gorbachev started meeting in kind of a detente, if you will, and it establishes a new type of relationship between the two countries. A number of things to check out here, but the one I'll draw attention to is that national defense spending. You can see during the Reagan years, highlighted in orange, that there's an increase in spending regarding the military. It's not as high as you see in 68, but keep in mind that in 68, the United States is in fighting a hot war in Vietnam, whereas during the 1980s, that hot war does not exist. The United States is not fighting a war elsewhere in the midst of the Cold War. As the 1980s continues on, we start to see a number of communist governments, specifically communist governments in Eastern Europe. They start to fall. This is the Eastern Bloc and countries that fall under the Warsaw Pact, and Poland, Czechoslovakia, Albania, all these communist regimes fall and communism ends in those nations. The fall of the Berlin Wall also occurs, and this is kind of that quintessential moment where the Cold War, it feels like the Cold War has officially come to an end. Additionally, it's important to remember the Soviet Union was an empire, and because the Soviet Union also falls during this time and once again becomes Russia, if you will, not a great way to phrase that, but the Soviet Union falls, and with the fall of the Soviet Union, there are 15 new republics that come into existence, which we'll see in a second. So a couple of maps here. The first one is, check the date, is from 1960. So you see NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And then the Warsaw Pact, which includes countries like East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia. So during this time, you see that Eastern Bloc, Eastern Europe, lots of communist countries, and they are attached to the Soviet Union through the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a response to the NATO alliance that was created prior to it. At the end of the Cold War, we see a lot of those Eastern Bloc countries fall to communism. They no longer have communism, if you will. But then the Soviet Empire also falls, and these there were 15 independent republics that were created with the fall of the Soviet Empire, and this gives you a window into those countries that were created or established with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Finally, let's take a look at the U.S. involvement in the Middle East and the Iran-Contra affair. In Lebanon, which is in the Middle East, they fell into a civil war, and the U.S. did involve itself. Continuing on from there, the United States ends up selling arms or weapons to Iran. What the US wanted to have happen was give weapons to Iran, and Iran would pressure the terrorists in Lebanon to release some hostages that had been taken inside Lebanon. Those hostages were US hostages. This really doesn't work. It's also a contradiction. The fact that the United States says it doesn't negotiate with terrorists, but here we are with the US kind of negotiating with terrorists. The Reagan administration sold these arms to Iran, which means they are receiving money for them. And what the Reagan administration does next with that money is it ends up funding anti-communist revolutionaries in Nicaragua. Those revolutionaries, those anti-communist revolutionaries, were Contras. Okay, so that was not supposed to happen. Once upon a time, earlier in the 1980s, the United States had supported this, but it later became banned by Congress. So the United States was aware that it was happening. It is banned, but the sale of weapons that to Iran, that money later went to continue to give the Contras support. So that makes it illegal at this time. So this became known to the American public. Reagan had to go on television and apologize for this mistake and illegal action by the administration. And that is the Iran-Contra affair. That's it for today. We'll see you next time.